Good afternoon. Welcome to the second in the series of Onwards Bounce Back Bigger series, which is looking to address some of the big economic challenges facing policymakers as we emerge from lockdown, kind of blinking into the sunlight and start to think seriously about how we ensure a strong and secure recovery. This event is on, as advertised, Generation C-19. How can we avoid a crisis for young people during, and I should say after, the pandemic? We know that young people may not be as affected by some of the health consequences of the virus. The transmission rates are much lower for younger people, but we do know that young people are more likely to be affected by some of the economic and social consequences of the virus. We've just been talking as a group of panelists about the fact that many young people are in shared housing, perhaps more keen to return to a traditional office environment than some older workers who might be kind of laid up in nice houses in the home counties rather than kind of tiny flats in parts of central London. We know that young people are more likely to be in insecure employment, more likely to be furloughed. So there are serious questions about how to ensure that the younger generation isn't additionally disadvantaged from this crisis, especially considering all of the work that Lord Willetts and others have done in the past about generational inequality and imbalances. So I'm delighted to be able to bring together a group of speakers who have a huge amount of knowledge and interesting ideas on this subject. I should also say at the beginning that this is a subject Onward has done lots of work on in the past, including with James Canigazorian, one of our speakers today. We published a report last year, Generation Y, which looked at the growing generational gap in terms of kind of policy and political difference that identified around 3 million young voters who we thought were kind of winnable to centre-right parties, but were not currently being converted into centre-right voters. But we also demonstrated the extent to which over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a big shift in voting attitudes amongst young people and a growing gap between younger and older generations in terms of the parties they vote for and the attitudes that they espouse in terms of both social and economic issues. And I'm sure James might touch on some of that work in his remarks. So our three speakers, I've already mentioned two of them, are three brilliant minds of the centre right. So I'm going to first, in a moment, after I've done some housekeeping rules, go to Laura Trott. Laura is someone that I worked with in government several years ago, has worked in a variety of roles in the private sector before becoming an MP at the last general election. Thank you very much for joining us, Laura. I'm then going to go. I'm going to go to James first, actually. So James Canigazorian will be our first speaker. James is a pollster extraordinaire. He currently is a partner at Hanbury Strategy, running their polling and qualitative research. Previously was where he's worked in banking and other private sector roles, but was very involved in Ruth Davidson's campaign in the 2017 general election that saw the Conservative Party win significantly more seats than they were forecast to do, even by Conservative Central Office. So James has been very involved in Scottish politics, and particularly interesting on how to appeal to younger generations through some of that work. And then finally, our last speaker will be Lord David Willetts, former Universities Minister, Chairman of the Resolution Foundation, and author of one of the biblical texts on generational inequality, The Pinch. So someone who comes with an extraordinary amount of knowledge and experience in this area. So a fantastic panel. The way in which this will work is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give 5 minutes of introduction. They'll set out their thoughts, their reflections on how to ensure that young people don't leave this crisis worse off than they came in, and potentially even better than before the crisis started. I will then open up to questions, and I would urge everyone on this call to add their questions to the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of the screen as people are talking, and I will pick up those questions during the Q&A after we've had all of our speakers' remarks. I'll have a few questions myself to kick off if people aren't forthcoming with their own questions, but I suspect, given the number of people we've got on the call, there will be lots. And if I could ask each of our speakers to stay on mute while they're not talking, and if anyone has any technical difficulties at any point, please just add them into the chat function separately from the Q&A, and there is the Onward team on standby to resolve anything as they arise. Finally, I will close the session very promptly at 2:30 to protect everyone's diaries and ensure that we can all carry on. But I look forward to a fantastic discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to James Kanagazorian for just some opening remarks, and particularly to understand a little bit about young people's attitudes going into the crisis and how they might change as a result of what we're experiencing. James.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to Onward for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to speak alongside Lord Willetts and Laura and yourself. I think a useful starting point, is a kind of pre-existing Onward report that was done, Generation Y, where we analysed how young people might be different from the rest of the population in terms of their social attitudes and their economic attitudes. And there are a couple of key theses out of that, which I think are worth analysing to see the degree to which they've changed post the crisis. So I think that we had 5 theses basically in the report. The first was that younger voters were kind of intrinsically more socially liberal than the rest of the population. The second was that they were economically further to the left than the rest of the population in terms of their attitudes on tax, on spending, on the size of the economy, attitudes towards the debt, the deficit. The third was that they were and perceived themselves to be economically worse off in terms of economic terms. The fourth was that structurally one of the reasons that was behind the politics of younger people was effectively a degree of institutional capture, whether that's of cultural institutions or educational institutions that predominantly reflect a culture that belongs more to the centre left than the centre right. We don't have time to analyse the degree to which all of those have changed. So I think I'll alight on 2, which I think have significantly changed or have the capacity to significantly change during the crisis. The first is on economics. I think one of the things going into the crisis is just a general perception that as your age increases, so does your propensity to believe in more free market principles, whether that's a kind of smaller government or more limited tax regime and spending regime. I think this crisis potentially has the ability to completely change and invert that curve or that relationship. And we already have fairly strong polling evidence that is the case. So for example, YouGov carried out a poll on the 8th of July that is very, very striking in terms of the attitudes of young people towards the state. So amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, which is the kind of group that's often cited as to represent young people, the number of people who believe that there should be an increase in tax on all citizens to effectively pay for a lot of the policies that have been enacted was 6% amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. The same support figure was 36% amongst over 65s. Even for a more qualified tax rise, so for the proposition that there should be an increase in tax amongst higher earning Britons, that had the support of only 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds, but 74% of 65-year-olds. The same pattern is also visible on policies to do with freezing the state pension, increasing borrowing and increasing corporation tax, where effectively over 65-year-olds are further on the left than they are on the right. That is an inversion of the predominant structural political trends of the last 40 years. And that has happened overnight. I think this is really interesting. This could have happened for a number of reasons. The first is that the Conservative Party in the centre-right is identifying itself far more with communitarian values and economic policies that are traditionally from the centre-left or the kind of social democratic left. It's hard to unpick cause and effect, but it's pretty striking that elite opinion amongst centre-right may well have had the effect of actually changing the structural beliefs of people who are older and therefore more likely to be conservative. I think also the economic reality of what's just happened is that the tax burden is going to fall on the working age population as opposed to the older population. And fundamentally, I think this is the most interesting thing that's going to come out of this. I think there are perhaps two or more other things, interesting things that I think are related to how young people might react to this crisis and their propensity either for a kind of structural crisis or actually the opposite, which I think it's worth exploring. The first is that cohort effect matters. So what I mean by that is events and a place and time can be as important as the actual age of a person. Why do we know this? Because support for the centre-right actually looks like a night tick. The reality is that the propensity for people to get more conservative as they get older is not the entire story. The youngest generation, so people who are just out of university or at university or in higher education or not in training at all, is that people who are 18 to 25 are significantly more conservative than people who are 25 to 35. There's a cohort effect, there's a generational effect that is semi-permanent, has been visible for the last 5 to 10 years. And that's very much informed by the political history that each cohort of people and voters graduates to. I think, therefore, when we think about the current crisis, it's very important to note that this will have a permanent cohort effect change on how people will vote in the future. And when you look at those polling evidence about how younger voters are now thinking much more about centre-right economics, that is extremely interesting. And the converse of that, which is that older people and even rich older people are now identifying far more with centre-left economics. The last 2 points I would just quickly make is I think this crisis and this pandemic also is an interesting question in terms of place and belonging and location, I think, which is intimately involved with the politics of younger people, which is often bifurcated between those who will go to university and join those kind of networks, rich kind of social human capital networks in cities, or those who will stay at home. And there are converse effects to people doing either of those. I think the possibility of opening up remote working and redistributing human capital and what's called the field of geodemographics may change semi-permanently or permanently the movements of younger people. We've basically gone through a period of the last 25 years where the number of people going into higher education has got to 50%. That's the first interesting part of the story. The second interesting part of the story is how that has changed cities, how cities have got younger, how areas have effectively disaggregated between younger and older areas, and that being a huge driver behind our politics. And I think the third most important thing is, I think, in terms of what's going to happen and the parameters, the public opinion parameters that this crisis is going to be played out in, is that I think the last 5 to 10 years have structurally been a debate about social values that originally sat fairly uncomfortably with two political propositions at the beginning of the 21st century that were largely economic movements, whether that's Labour or the Conservative Party. I think now we are in the middle of an economic debate, having gone through 10 to 15 years where broadly it has been a debate about the vision of the country and about the type of kind of social society that we live in, and the debate about social liberalism or illiberalism. I think that's really interesting because I'm not sure people have caught up to that. That's what I would have to say to open my remarks.
James, thank you very much. That was fantastic, and it's just fascinating to hear some of the data as it's emerging, and as you say, to see some of the kind of changing attitudes in real time. Laura, you're someone who's worked in government on young people's policy. You've done lots of work in Number 10, working for David Cameron on that, and you're now a member of Parliament, I presume, with lots of younger constituents, and seeing some of these issues arise for young people over the last few months. What's your take on how policymakers should be thinking about the risks for the younger generation and how to mitigate them?
Thanks, Will, and thank you for organising this. It's a delight to speak amongst David and James today. I think the first point is that this is the first recession which has the potential to hit the very, very young. So when we think about kids at school now, it is the most disadvantaged who are most likely not to be getting remote learning, and also where it is provided to them, most likely to be not using that, which is going to be a huge issue as we go forward, and one that we need to address. And in terms of university provisions, we are conducting a big social experiment here in terms of the value of remote learning and how that is as opposed to physical learning. And again, I think we do need to be careful about looking at the implications of that for the most disadvantaged in our society. You know, care leavers that are going on to university without the pastoral and other types of support that will be there otherwise, I think is something that we're going to have to look at from a policy perspective going forward. And then there's also the traditional lens of looking at the impact of this through the fact that young people are more likely to have been furloughed, they're more likely to have lost their jobs at the beginning of this. I think a third of students have, of sort of 18-24s have, versus a sixth of the population more widely. And we know, were discussing before, that there are mental health effects of not going into work, not being able to learn from your peers, to have that networking effect that we're going to look at. So I think there are lots of policy implications that are arising out of what has happened here that we're going to be grappling with for some time to come. And I think we need to not make the same mistakes that we made in 2008, where actually there were very long-term problems that were caused with the cohort, particularly the ones coming out of university and leaving apprenticeship schemes, that we did something to grapple with as a government, but I don't think a lot. When I look at, my sister came out of university in 2008, and her peer group has been affected by this. In the long run, many of them have still struggled with mental health issues, with getting into the labour force. It's never really been the same, and that's borne out, I think, by the evidence. It's anecdotal, but I think it's borne out by the evidence. We didn't quite get it right for young people beforehand, and it's absolutely an obligation on us to get it right this time round. So in terms of what we do and how we deal with those problems, I think the Chancellor's statement last week went a long way to set out what we're doing in terms of young people's jobs, and I think that's very important and a very good first step. The Kickstarter scheme, action on apprenticeships, traineeships, a little bit more around action on hospitality, where young people are more likely to work. All those things will be incredibly important in terms of maintaining and starting jobs and giving people jobs as they're coming out of university or college or training. But I think there's a wider perspective here that we need to make sure that we continue to focus on. The education point is really important. We must make sure that we don't end up with a huge disadvantage gap coming out of the differential that young people have had in terms of their educational experience. Now, part of that will be the catch-up camps that are taking place, but a lot of it will be around really focusing on this as an issue for people throughout their schooling lives. These things can't be caught up in a couple of weeks. This is going to be an ongoing problem that we're going to need to deal with as a government in the months and years ahead. Secondly, around universities, I do think we have to look at what support and provision is being given to younger people, more disadvantaged people, both for going through university now, but also as they're coming out into the workplace. They won't have those traditional support networks that would be in place otherwise. And I think otherwise what we're going to see is a really a widening of the opportunity gap that is in place throughout our education system from school to university. I think there's also a point about as we're looking at jobs now, to monitor the impact that this is having, and looking at the cohort effect in terms of where we are in the income bracket, because it may be that certain types of people are more able to access these schemes, and we need to look at where we're advertising them and how we're targeting them to make sure that they're having the biggest possible effect. Just to respond to James a little bit on, I found his presentation fascinating in terms of particularly the point around the economic response and whether it is centre left or centre right. Because of the causation of this, it's very much been something which has been caused by a rapid drop in demand. We've not got a supply side issue here, we've got a rapid drop off in demand, which has led to a huge lack of consumption in the economy. And I think as a result, the economic fix has to be one which addresses that. Now, traditionally, that will be seen as a centre-left response, putting more money into the economy. But I think the Chancellor said the other day that we need to be post-ideological about this, and I think that's right. This is not necessarily spending, increasing consumption because it is something that is of the mindset. It's more like because of the fundamental causation of this issue, that is the right thing to do in response. And then I thought the other interesting point that James made was around, well, many interesting points, but one of them was around housing. I think this actually could give us an opportunity to solve a large part of the housing crisis in terms of if jobs are able to be more remote now, and that young people can enter the workforce, working remotely in an area where houses are cheaper. That has a real potential, I think, to address a huge disadvantage that's been present for many, many years. So I think creative policy responses in this area are going to be absolutely critical, and working alongside big companies in the way that they alter the pattern of their jobs, and you know, whether they go to regional hubs, and how that fits into the workplace going forward. So I think this is a time where there's going to be huge issues for policymakers, but I think the potential to make some really big changes which could help people in the future. But I think we need to be particularly cognizant of the impact on inequality as we go through from schools, universities, all the way to the jobs market.
Laura, thank you very much. There was a huge amount in there, both in terms of diagnosis, but also potentially some areas to focus for solutions. Lord Willetts, I'd love to know what you think about what the government should be doing on all this.
Yeah, and thanks very much for the invitation to join you guys. And I agree with a lot of what James and Laura have said. And the coronavirus crisis has hit younger people particularly hard. I mean, we're familiar with all the economic measures. Actually, buried in one of our resolution publications, there's the point about the space occupied by people of different ages. So if you are locked down at home, it is worth remembering that people in their 20s and 30s are likely to have under 30 square meters of space. People in their 50s have got over 40 square meters. People in their 60s and older have got over 50 square meters. So it is just a tougher environment. And all those things are being brought home by the crisis. But you rightly say, so what should we do about it? And here's just a very short list of options, building on what we've already heard. First of all, the jobs market. And here, the 30 to 50-year-olds have done best. They're most likely to have kept their jobs. They're most likely to be able to work from home. It's the under 30s who've been badly affected, and interestingly, the over 60s. But as Laura said, the difference is that for the under 30s, there's a long-term scarring effect, which is particularly acute. Now, I hope the Chancellor's imaginative measures last week really helped. They certainly will have an impact. What he's clearly trying to do is to get going the sectors like retail and hospitality, where we know younger people are concentrated. However, I have to say, I think some of the shifts, both in the cost of delivering those services and shifts in attitudes to going out and shopping physically rather than buying online, I don't see those going back to the world as it was before. So I am concerned that we just don't see jobs recovery in the key sectors where the younger people are. Now and that's why I think a strand in the budget is going to get more important is green economy jobs. That's where you can see labor-intensive activities working lit through building by building, house by house, improving their energy efficiency. That is both labor-intensive, and it also appeals to the concerns and idealism of young people about what's happening to the climate. And I personally think that in the long run is going to be a more important source of jobs for younger people than the revitalization of established sectors. First point. Second point, on education. And there's a particular issue for young people leaving education this year, leaving into a terrible jobs market, where again, there've been some great initiatives around traineeships. That's fantastic. I personally think there's more of a challenge here for education providers. Like Laura, I'm a great fan of online education, and the challenge is to give that the same pedagogic value as traditional education, and I think that's possible. But now is the time to implement some of the Auger proposals on HE. I didn't agree with everything in Auger, but one of the points he made quite rightly was that our university funding, higher education funding, is organized around 3 years honours courses. It should be possible for someone to get shorter term financing, to do a 6-month certificate, to get a level 4, level 5, to maybe go back to college or university and get something extra without signing on for a 3-year course. There are regulatory barriers to that, and they should be removed. And we can learn a lot from Australia. There's an Australian Pathfinder program, which I do recommend to people, which is the Australian government's educational response to the crisis, which has been to make short courses easier to access and easier to fund. And so I think we need to be more imaginative than we have been so far in what we fund educationally. On the benefits side, third on my list, just a reminder of how the world has changed in the last, I think it's 5 years. 5 years ago, benefits for pensioners were 48% higher than a benefit for an unemployed person. They're now 74% higher than benefits for an unemployed person. So the gap, the cash fees of benefits for working age, the triple lock for pensioners, has opened up an ever wider gap. Now, I don't believe in just increasing benefit spending, but if you look at for example, the DWP rules on training and education, rules like you can lose your entitlement to UC if you're doing more than 16 hours study. Another way of helping people get a bit more education and training would be on a temporary basis to liberalize some of the benefit rules to make it easier to do that kind of stuff while you're claiming benefits. That'd be third on my list. And then last two, the tricky issue of tax. And I wasn't quite clear from James's presentation how this plays out, but at some point, however rapid the recovery and however tough we are on public spending, I do think that at some point, there's going to have to be some increases in taxation, and there'll then be a debate about who pays. And my view is that when we look at the distribution of wealth as well as earnings, it's absolutely clear that the money is concentrated amongst older people. And I would not like to see more tax on earnings. The labour market is where the hit is. That's where the younger people are. And I do think there has to be a Tory debate about taxes on property, not because we hate wealth, not because we are believers in egalitarianism, but just because if reluctantly, more in sorrow than in anger, we have to raise some taxes, which ones do we put up and who pays? And I hope the optimistic interpretation of what you're saying is older people seeing what is happening to their children and grandchildren are willing themselves to recognize they have to make a contribution out of their resources rather than expecting the younger generation to do it. Then fifth and finally on my list, and this is really a kind of social corporate behavior rather than public policy. But when we try to investigate how people move on in the world, how they take the opportunities of social mobility, how they move jobs, I've been very influenced by the American sociologist Mark Granavetta, who's written about what he calls the strength of weak ties. So his argument is that the most important thing may not be who your parents are and things like that. It's those elaborate wider networks of links and connections, which mean that you get to hear about that job that's going somewhere, that you've got some people who think of you when they're making appointments. And I think the shift of the world online, look at events like this, has really disadvantaged younger people. 30 years ago, if I'd have been in an audience or a participant in an event like this, after it had ended, for 10 minutes, we'd have all milled around. I'd have gone up to someone who'd asked a question that had interested me. Someone would have come up for me and put a question to me. And it's the moment when we all click on the leave button at the end of these discussions is, for a younger person, is when you lose 10 minutes of networking and social capital. That is far more significant to them, to the older generation like myself, who we built up our networks and friends and contacts, that we've always trying to expand them. And one company I'm talking to, the boss was saying that she had created an in-company lottery to create the opportunity of standing next to someone in the queue for the coffee or in the lift, where every member of the company was randomly 2 or 3 times a week, linked up with another member of the company. And it was important, everyone was in it, the CEO, the board of directors, anything that created the random connections, which despite the power of social media, I still think, and that Westminster and Whitehall is an example, just running into someone in the corridor, picking up a conversation with someone at the end of an event. And that is where I think younger people stuck with their laptop on the kitchen table in a cramped flat are particularly losing out. And I think we all have to be more imaginative in thinking of ways in which those type of connections can be made available, even in our currently very constrained circumstances. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. So many interesting ideas and I know that you could have gone on for hours about the diagnosis of the problem, but it's brilliant to hear you suggesting some innovative solutions. We've had a few questions in the Q&A, which I will come to in a second. I'd encourage others to add to them as well if they would like. But I wanted to start with something that James highlighted, which I think is a kind of fascinating question, which I hadn't even begun to kind of think about before this event, which is what will the cohort effects of this crisis be? And I think, James, you kind of started to answer it with some of the data that you cited, but we do know that from previous big events, the financial crisis being one, the 1980s arguably another, kind of big generational changes in attitudes can happen in very short spaces of time from moments of history, as it were. I suppose it may be too early to tell, but I just wondered whether or not I might go to both Laura and then David to just tease out what their views are. And James, you feel free to come back on this as well if you'd like, after I've come to Laura and David. But just whether you think this crisis will make people more or less conservative, and young people in particular. Laura, I'd love your thought. I mean, I'm slightly putting you on the spot, so don't worry too much if you don't have a ready-made answer, but if you have any.
I think that what I hope is that what this government is defined by is a good and positive response to this crisis that genuinely helps people. And I think we've seen that certainly with the furlough scheme. I mean, this is a completely innovative scheme that came, from nowhere, that has been rolled out very, very successfully. What I hope is that things like the Kickstarter scheme have a similar effect, and it's done, and it's means of helping people, but in a conservative way, that have done very effectively. And I think competent government is always the thing that people want, and I think competent government from the Conservatives, which is shown to help people in a way which is delivering conservative means, I think it is the most important thing, and I think will hopefully prove beneficial and will be useful. But it's always, governing in a crisis is very dangerous because you are very much defined by your response. But I think, I think in this case, hopefully, it will be a positive thing for conservatism overall.
Interesting. So it might change people's views of conservatism and what that means. That's interesting.
Yeah, and the flexibility of it, and ideologically as well, I think is important.
Yeah. David?
I mean, the government's response has been effective and kind of non-ideological. And I guess behind it, what it's reminded people of is the conservative case for government, which is different from the socialist case. The conservative case for government is simply the nation state is the biggest insurance pool we've got. It's what we turn to help protect us from risks no individual can be expected to protect themselves from. And that, which I think has been missing in this highly divisive debate, where the left just think it's about promoting equality and the right state is always useless and hopeless and the smaller the better. This has reminded us that there is a classic conservative argument that is very relevant. As to what it means long term on attitudes, and James is the expert, I'd have thought the danger is people become very risk averse. I mean, this is and conservatives want enterprise, initiative, some risk taking. And I think if you are struggling to make ends meet, if you think your company can be randomly knocked off track by an event like this, the fear is that it makes us, in the worst sense, in business, small c conservative, focusing on resilience and safety, rather than initiative and enterprise. But I hope I'm wrong.
James, did you want to come back beyond what you said earlier, or do you feel?
I feel like that's been broadly covered. Some interesting points laid out there. I think it's too early to really structurally understand what the cohort effects are. I think we're just about getting to grips with what the cohort effects were from the great financial crisis, which I think was a kind of structural change in views of capitalism amongst younger people to the left, but also had a lot of other unintended consequences as well, which to do with kind of personalized way of viewing the economy as well, which kind of came out of that period, as well as a more flexible attitude in terms of the labour market, of switching jobs more regularly and kind of bidding up, as it were, your kind of job title and what you were doing. I think it's too early to try to draw parallels and try and understand that, but it has been interesting to note the 180 that's occurred on economics. Let's see. I think a lot of that is to do with people effectively doing their own forecast about where the balance of burden might fall after the crisis.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go to our first question from the audience, which are, and we've had a number of them coming in thick and fast. So Vincent Masterson, who is a second-year political economy student at City University, and I think, Vincent, you've been to Onward events before, you're a familiar name, has asked how businesses can ensure that young people, starting with them, feel like an integral part of the team, and so how businesses manage the involvement of young people, especially new entrants into the labour market, I suppose, given the fact that they're spending a majority of their time from home. Now, David, you spoke about this briefly. I'd love to know what the Resolution Foundation is doing for your young interns or new researchers or whatever. But then I'll come to James next, then Laura after you've said your piece.
Yeah, and as you said at the beginning, Will, and following on from the conversation we were having before we opened up, what I notice at Resolution is often it's the youngest researchers who are living in the most cramped accommodation, who really are trying to do serious work from a laptop. It might not even be in the kitchen. It might be even more constrained. You know, if you've got your flatmate in there, for them, getting back into the office matters a lot. So I think and we're only a tiny organization, but I think across the business sector, it's really important that opportunities are now created for people to meet, which is partly virtually, of course, but I actually do think some arrangements in which people are expected to be in the office are quite important, because it's very hard to do it half and half. And I would hope and expect to see arrangements where people say, look, the aim is that as many of us are subject to social distancing, we're all in on Wednesday, and that's an opportunity to meet up. So yeah, I do think young people in particular need those type of opportunities. And it is, of course, you can do a lot online, but often the online communication follows from having first met in some other circumstances. I'm now in the position where we've got a new recruit at Resolution who I've only ever met through a screen. I have not physically met him. And that is maybe this is just my age, that is a different way of building up a relationship with a fellow member of the team than when you've gone online, having previously also physically worked alongside.
Very good. James, if I could come to you next. I mean, you're also someone who works with lots of young people. You have a big team at Hanbury, lots of whom I suspect are relatively new to the labour market. They're in kind of first or second jobs. How have you approached this issue? And more generally, how do you think businesses should be thinking about this?
It's a great question. You know, I've hired 4 people into my team, 3 of whom I've never met before. So a very similar problem to David. I would say we've approached it quite structurally. You'd be unsurprised, David, trying to analyze exactly what it is that is missing from an online experience, and then I can talk a little bit about that process. So I think there are 4 things that are missing predominantly from an online environment versus physical, beyond of course the fact that you're not meeting them physically. And I think they are the ability to learn in very quick feedback loops. Like learning is a system that relies on loops and feedback and a kind of a degree of discussion, and it's rapid. And a lot of it is latent. Whereas if you're online, things have to be kind of demarcated very clearly and said and spoken, whereas a lot of communication is nonverbal. So there's that. There's also the degree of mentoring, which is more of a long form thing, which is developing a relationship which is about the unsaid thing, or the problem that is not immediately obvious, or maybe of second order, or maybe nothing to do with the work, but to do with the structures of work and how people get on with each other. Because one thing about the online environment is that what it does is it removes a dimension from human activity, which is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. So for example, if the 5 of us were sat in a room, I would not only be able to understand how person A was talking to person B, but how person A and C and B were getting on with each other, independent of their interaction with me, which obviously leads to a much more complex series of insights. And that fundamentally is missing. So that's what I would say about mentoring, which is taking time out of the day. And then the other 2 things I think that are kind of the biggest pillars of missing from physical work, particularly for younger people. The third, and they're related, would be connections. So David has alighted on that already, talking about the strength of weak ties. How young people make connections, I think, is very much linked to the concept of social mobility, in that people from more middle class, privileged backgrounds have wider reserves of confidence and already know existing people. Like, a lot often how you meet someone is by reference to a known point. And clearly, depending on your income level that you've grown up with, you're just more likely to know certain people if you're from a certain background or you grew up in London, for example. Therefore, elaborating on the discipline of helping people make connections, I think, is really important, and helping that process. I can talk a little bit about that later. And I think the 4th thing is randomness. A lot about joining a workforce is about the benefits of introducing randomness into people's daily life. So that, for example, novelty, if you think about the value creation, is effectively an equation of introducing randomness with the degree of talent and then a task. It's an absolutely critical part of the equation to produce value, where people put together 2 ideas or a context or a capability that they didn't know could coexist with something else, and therefore come to a novel idea or solution or scenario. And I think that when people talk about the difficulties and the quite linear nature of online learning, often what they're describing is the lack of randomness to it. So companies across kind of the UK, I mean, there are different ways of doing that. But what I've tried to do, at least, is to, first of all, define things that I think are missing. Of course, everyone will have their own mental model of what that is, and that's great. And then capturing what that is. So once you've defined it, actually then practically saying, okay, what would I do then to address that need? And then the third thing would be scaling that proposition. So it's no point defining a problem and then suggesting, right, this is what I do, and then you're not able to execute that. So coffee roulettes are one that is particularly useful to introduce a degree of randomness. Having more one-on-one sessions with people, far more than you would do in the physical environment. And in terms of mentoring and learning, I think having a lot of online sessions where you effectively allow people far more corporate contact with learning environments. So we have a lot of teach-ins, we have a lot of people coming in to speak. I think those kinds of modules, as it were, can be really helpful. But I simply think that the one thing I haven't mentioned, which is not to do with something that a company can do, but that's friendship. And I think a lot of your career is based on who you interact with at the beginning of your career. And it is very, very hard to replicate that degree of connection with someone. And I think employers have to think about that.
Thank
you very much, James. Laura.
I think James had a brilliant analysis there of it. And I think that the main point is around the kind of the structured interaction and being thoughtful about what is missing out and then what you can do as a result. The one thing I would add on to James's point is the converse, what actually leads into the kind of the friendship point, is around a lot of people who are struggling, having mental health issues, victims of abuse at home. Their outlet is work, and that's how it's often picked up. That's where they get looked to for help. It's where they can often find sources of support, and it's how companies manage to replicate that in the online world, which I think is going to be a huge challenge. A lot of companies have, we have in the House of Commons, a lot of helplines that people have pointed to, but there's a lot of counselling that takes place. Excuse me, I've got thousands of children running around downstairs, so you might be able to hear some of them. But a lot of what happens in companies is that you have support structures which are put in place, which are largely physical. And I think that the challenge will be making sure that we replicate those in the online world, and that they are robust and they are picking up people and identifying the people that most need the help, because this is somewhere where I think those human connections are actually really important.
Thank you very much, Laura. That is brilliant. I am going to now try and just bring up, if I can use Zoom properly. So we've had lots of other questions. We have a question from Ronald Lehman, who is asking what parents really want to know is, will there be employment opportunities for their student offspring, or should they consider delaying leaving education for as long as possible? Should students or college or traineeship leavers be launching themselves into this very brutal labour market, or should they be trying to continue their learning? David, I wonder if you in particular might want to come in on this, given you're a former universities minister and are very active in the education debate. But James or Laura, I'd love to bring you in afterwards as well.
Yeah, it is tough for education leavers at whatever level you're trying to leave, and that their chances of finding a job are poor. And that's why, if there is some useful extra education experience you can have, it is worthwhile. And that's why I think at all levels we need to be a bit more flexible about keeping young people in contact with education, especially given the disruption their education will have had over the last 6 months. Particularly at the university level, what this is driving has been one of the sort of observable trends in the last few years, they're not much remarked on, and that is the rapid growth of master's degrees and master's courses for an extra year. And many, I'm sure, and I think the early evidence is coming in, another surge in applications to a master's program. I always used to say to my friends in government who are proudly trying to push 2-year courses, I say, yes, of course, make that should be available. It should be part of a diverse system. But I'll have a modest bet with you that 4-year courses grow more rapidly than 2-year courses, because lots of young people now want to get a master's, and that trend is being reinforced.
Thank you. James, did you want to come in? What's your advice for young people today, or their parents, about whether or not to enter the labour market or stay in education?
Well, I think probably without wishing to presume, yourself, Will, and Laura, we graduated at a kind of similar-esque time where peers, colleagues, friends and family all were faced with this exact debate after the great financial crisis before it or during it. And the responses, and I think the data is not entirely clear about who did better, or can that be disaggregated from the types of people that stay on at university versus those that go into the world of work. I think one of the real problems of this current crisis is that students and young people have effectively gone from an unstructured, structured environment with milestones into one with none of those, with no landing zone between the two. So if you think about being a 16-year-old who's about to go into higher education, for example, I know that many of them do not. You kind of know what your life is going to look like. The great debate would have been, am I going to do a 3-year degree or a 4-year degree or an apprenticeship, or what am I going to do? But fundamentally, you understood the landscape of what your next 5 to 10 years might look like, and you had milestones that people knew. I think entering a labour market where you've been denied those milestones, so a proper graduation. Many people have graduated over Zoom or have effectively not seen their friends. They have lost something structured that is basically part of the architecture of life. And then they're then entering the next part, which normally is both chaotic, but has the benefits of chaos as well, which is, people might move to a new city and live in 4 or 5 different places in 3 years. They might try out a number of jobs. They may, at that critical point, that's the point at which a human being might meet the greatest number of people across a year as a metric, as the year after they graduate. They're being denied all of that, and they're entering a very chaotic environment that has none of the upsides of chaos, creative upsides of chaos, but all of the downsides of uncertainty. So from a personal perspective, and it is personal, not political, I would say a delay makes some sense. before you know more facts. I think fundamentally knowing more stuff is useful, but again, that's entirely personal, and I think many people will differ.
Thanks, James. Laura, what's your view?
I think advice in this area is always slightly dangerous because everyone's circumstances are so difficult. I also am wary about trying to second guess the labour market. It's never predictable and things change very rapidly. And if you do something which you didn't necessarily want to do to delay your exit for another year and then the labour market's worse, you're going to end up in quite a sticky situation. So I think people need to take the decisions that are right for them. But I think this is around having those ongoing, as David said, those ongoing opportunities to retrain, to move around, to take on more as you go through your career, which is going to make these decisions easier. And I think that as a government is what we need to focus on putting in place.
Thanks, Laura. Just jumping in myself on the back of what James said about leaving university very shortly after 2008. I mean, my kind of memory of that period is that it was really tough, and that I, both myself and lots of my friends, found it difficult to identify jobs, and often had to work for free for many months before we could actually get a foothold on the kind of basic level in the labour market. Although working for free at Westminster think tanks at the time was not as unusual as it perhaps is now. But the interesting thing, I think, or a really big part of this debate, is the responsibility of employers. Because through Onward, I have been inundated with emails from young people wanting experience and wanting to get some level of a kind of foothold in the policy debate. And at a time when it's economically very difficult, it's really hard for employers to actually kind of give those people opportunities. But I feel quite strongly that we and others should be doing more to support young people. And so what the Chancellor did last week is actually really important, just giving employers more confidence to actually give young people a shot, and to encourage them to think about younger applicants more seriously than perhaps they might have been able to previously. But it's a really tricky debate. Okay, so we've got a few more questions, and we've got about 20 minutes left. So I'm going to try and ask people to keep comments relatively brief from here on in, if you can. And we have a question about the idea of working from anywhere. So people have been talking about the death of distance since the 1990s at least. As this question suggests, there have been a few case studies or examples of private companies renting out desk space for employees in multiple places where they live in order to give them a working environment close to their home, and the idea of kind of disaggregated workplaces. I don't know. I mean, clearly we've been disaggregated in terms of we've been in our homes for the last few weeks and months. But do people genuinely believe that the workplace is going to become more fragmented, or do they think that people will revert back to something a bit like the office environment that we had shortly before this crisis? Laura, you are not on mute, so I'm going to come to you first.
I am really excited by this idea. I think it has really interesting and positive possible implications. I'm going to be very quick, I promise. But basically, firstly, in terms of housing crisis, as I spoke about earlier, this has the opportunity to allow people to work outside of very densely populated and expensive cities. Secondly, for women, in terms of flexibility, being able to work around families, I think that's really interesting. And thirdly, just from a regional regeneration point of view, this has the potential to really rejuvenate the high streets up and down the country, because you've got to have lots of people who are working more from home during the week, using high streets for lunches, to go out for coffees in the afternoon. So I think it has really interesting and positive policy implications that I think we should try and capitalise on from now.
Thank you, Laura. James, you next.
Thanks, Will. I'll just keep the remarks brief. I'm not sure on this about whether it's necessarily a positive or negative, or which way it's going to go. The consultant in me thinks there's basically going to be a bifurcation between businesses that are on the go. So you've seen Pret have closed 100 stores. So anything that is transitory and effectively on the way to our hub from different spokes, there'll be a huge amount of economic issues around those types of businesses, like traveling to work. The economy that is structured around going to work and back from work is clearly going to change. But I think there's huge upsides, as Laura has just mentioned. But yeah, I think it could have the ability to create more equalities. I mean, fundamentally, a more disaggregated workforce necessarily means that more people can do more things in more spaces, which fundamentally on a mathematical level means you don't get these clusters which draw together wealth and investment and infrastructure investment as much as it has done, which I think is part of our politics of division for the last 10 years. So I think broadly on balance, more positive than negative, but I think there's going to be a lot of consequences, the types of businesses that are set up.
I wonder whether David's going to agree with this, because there might be a bifurcation in terms of types of job as well. So graduate knowledge economy jobs that are able to be done from home might become decentralized or disaggregated, whereas more kind of physical or manufacturing or industrial jobs might need to maintain a physical presence. David, what's your view?
Well, I'm so predictable. You've just completely predicted what I was going to say. And look, I loved Laura's optimism. And of course, there's a slug of the labour market to which that applies. But I have to say, our work so far at Resolution suggests that people whose jobs are most capable of being done in the way Laura describes tend to be people who've already got other advantages as well, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a crime. Good. And let's see that more flexible economy. But it doesn't apply to Deliveroo drivers, and it doesn't apply to people working in care homes. And there's a range of other jobs that won't be affected. So there is indeed the danger is that we remove some barriers and boundaries, but we create another one between two very different styles of working. But I hope Laura's right. I mean, and what we don't yet know is how far we can go in the kind of revolution she's.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so there are a few questions specifically to James on polling numbers, which I suppose is inevitable when you're talking about young people and getting one of the kind of doyens of numerical analysis about young people's attitudes in the room. So James, I'm just going to address two quick questions directly to you, if that's all right. If others want to jump in, just raise your hand, but given they're directed at you mainly, James, I think best to kind of hit them on the head quickly. So firstly, from Angus Groom, we have, is there a way of seeing how hard or soft the numbers are that you describe about young people becoming potentially more conservative? As in the midst of the crisis, this might be quite a volatile period in terms of attitude. And then secondly, potentially a kind of related question, to what extent do you think the kind of increasingly conservative economics of young people might be reflected in voting behaviour? Are we going to start to see that big gap close between younger and older voters in terms of conservative voting patterns? So James, quickly on those two would be great.
Thanks, Angus. Great and very specific question. Yes, there's a high degree of uncertainty. It takes years for these kind of trends to pan out. That is best observed by looking at the percentage of people that answer don't know to any specific questions like that. And as you've probably correctly identified, Angus, the don't know percentages are a lot higher for younger people versus older people who are more settled in their position, which clearly implies that there has been a shift, but it continues to be quite a fluid and volatile situation. In my mind, looking at the polling data, that implies that trend could actually get that 180 that I've described of economics could be even sharper than people realize. Like if you're already seeing an inversion of a traditional pattern observed even when 40% of young people don't opt for a response, that could imply that if they break in a similar way to existing people, that can imply that trend would be very sharp the other way. The second question, which was around how is this likely to play into voting patterns? Yeah, if I had an answer for that. But fundamentally, it's all about your mental model of how people vote and the relationship of voters to parties. Some of that inversion, I think, is to do with a response to how the parties have positioned themselves on the economy and the signals from elite opinion. So it's not like young people have immediately got economically left wing and older people right wing, and older people have got left wing in a vacuum. That's happened with loads of signals. Apologies, I cut out there for a second. Fundamentally, I think it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years for us to know what the true impacts are. It entirely depends on where the Labour Party actually position themselves. And this is a policy debate, but structurally, the party that would traditionally be best placed to argue for entirely economically liberal with a big L policies, which is the Liberal Democrats, don't appear to be occupying the space at all. And traditionally their vote, which is now just a vote that is related to how much money a family has and how big their house is. Like the Liberal Democrat vote is just a function of income now, and it hasn't been for the last 40 years, but it was in 2019. They don't appear to be part of this debate at all. And I think until that is settled, then you won't really know what the effect is.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to the last 3 or 4 questions just to try and get as many in as I can before we close in 10 minutes or so. So Jim Clark asks, do you think we're going to see a retraction or reduction, I guess, in the number of people wanting to take up residential university places as a result of this crisis? And would this be a good thing, question mark? And a kind of separate but related question, how badly will the university sector be affected by lower numbers of overseas students, cross-subsidising both domestic fees and research as well? Lord Willetts, you're a former university minister. How I've heard you on the radio about talking about this in the last few days, actually. So I think I probably know what you might say. But I'd love. I was listening to you. But what are your views, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think for universities, I think for an 18-year-old at that stage of your career, the experience of moving away from home into a kind of semi-supervised environment, the transition to adulthood side of the university experience is important. They may be wary of turning up at campus in September, October, depending on how the virus is going. Then I think universities have to be imaginative in doing some of the stuff that Laura was describing, starting contact with your students online, trying to get them engaged online with the hope they can physically move to the campus when it's all completely safe and the virus is in headlong retreat. So I personally think actually we're going to see a lot of, well, we know from the UCAS data, if anything, a further increase in the number of young people applying for university. Overseas students is the bigger risk because the universities do depend on that income. And I think there we're probably going to see more mixed learning. Eventually, I think students in China or India will want some kind of UK experience being in the UK. So I personally do think that the long-term trend of increasing overseas students and increasing domestic participation will probably carry on, but there's going to have to be some flexibility in linking online and physical attendance.
Thank you, David. Laura.
Thanks. Well, I hope that we go back to physical versions of university as soon as possible. I think that we're unlikely to see a decline just purely because the alternatives, I don't think, are necessarily sensible ones to be taking right now. If you would like to go to university, then not going right now and stepping out into the labour market, I would question as to whether that's a wise decision. I think what we need to do is look at the quality of what is happening though. It's very important that this generation of students, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, are not disadvantaged as a result of what is happening, and that what is being provided by university is of high quality, it engages pupils, you still have that kind of one-to-one attention, and that we are monitoring outcomes as a result of this, because I think it'd be very interesting to look at what impact this has on student education overall. But I think we're unlikely to see a dip. I think the impact financially of overseas students and what's happening there, as David alluded to, is going to be very important, and we're going to have to manage that on the university sector overall. But I think my overriding concern is that students don't suffer as a result of that, and I think that's what we all need to be working towards as a country in the coming months.
Thank you. James, did you want to come in on this question, or David, you just wanted to come back quickly, and then I'll come.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on what Laura said, because I think it's very important. Initially, just as the digital revolution, when it reaches any other sector, you start by doing what you're doing before, but just doing it digitally. So you do a lecture or a seminar on Zoom or Teams or whatever. It really gets important when you have innovations in pedagogy as a result of doing education online. And Laura mentioned monitoring. Actually, monitoring educational progress, if someone is studying online, is easier to do than when they are physically in classes. The amount of data you can collect about them is enormous, where the education system is way behind the health system in debating the ethics of exactly how much of this data you collect and what you do with it. But I personally think one of the good things from all this online education will be advances in pedagogy as we understand better how people are learning and what they're learning.
We just have to make sure we do it, I think would be the point. I'm in total agreement. It's a really exciting opportunity, but we have to make sure we actually take advantage of that.
Indeed, and David, what you were saying about digitizing what we already do. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of the Harvard Business School digital lecture theatres, but they are literally an exact replica of a lecture theatre with a screen instead of students. It's totally bizarre, but it is just a digital replica of a seminar. Okay, we've got 2 more questions in 8 minutes, so hopefully we can get through it and close to protect everyone's diaries. So Charles Patterson asks, do the panel expect, this is less on the kind of young people specifically, do the panel expect a regional or urban rural pattern to the recovery, and what would the implications of that be? Perhaps if you could talk about the implications of that for young people specifically as well as more generally. James, you didn't come in on the last one, so why don't I come to you first if you're interested in commenting.
Again, these are all really interesting questions. We're in the middle of what's happening, and it can be very, very hard to kind of now cast exactly what will be massive structural changes. Just a couple of thoughts on from what the data I think is suggesting, and how that might impact where young people are and voting patterns. There seems to be a number of theses around cities, which range from they'll decline and contract significantly, and people will look to move elsewhere, and jobs will go, and a kind of virtuous circle between high income earning people and a tax base and public services is broken, which is a wheel, and wealth moves to the suburbs, versus people who broadly think that actually things will stay as they are and we'll go back to how things were. I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle between that. I think the United States of America offers a number of really interesting examples of de-urbanization and flight from cities that have occurred during periods of economic volatility, whether that's kind of Detroit or New York in the 70s. I know that a lot of policymakers there are thinking about those issues right now and about the types of campaigns they would need to do, about the pressures. I think the debate in the UK is a little bit different, because our London and other great big cities in the UK are more diversified. They're not attached to any specific industry. Broadly, I think there is going to be a move toward a flight to space. I think this crisis has taught us there's a premium on space, and there's likely to be an impact on that. And the best data for that is estate agents. So talking to people who work for online kind of property portals, and the data that's available, the number of queries that are being made in areas that are less dense have massively gone up on a like-for-like basis, with the decrease even with the pent-up demand of lockdown, meaning that a lot of people have property queries to go through. So that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you. Laura, regional or urban, rural, obviously the government has a big levelling up agenda. Is that becoming a lot harder at the moment?
I think in many ways, as I think I spoke about earlier, it has a real potential to be made easier, because I think that if you move people out of cities, Manchester and London, and you take their spending power and transmit it to suburban locations, that has a potential for a huge amount of remodelling away from urban centres. Now, that obviously, as James spoke about earlier, has some transitional impact. So I think that this is a moment of real change. We don't really know where we are though. Cities are not yet back to where they were. So, Manchester, London, we haven't got the theatre shows, we haven't got restaurants fully functioning yet. The reason people are in cities is not really back to normal. So I don't think we've really seen what the behaviours will be like in recovery yet. So it's difficult to tell, but I think it is an opportunity for more renewal outside of cities. And I hope high streets, when I think about, I represent Sevenoaks, I think it's a huge opportunity for Sevenoaks to build out some to rebuild our high street, to make sure that we've got aspects for remote working, try and encourage companies to build hubs there. I think there's a huge opportunity for suburban locations to try and do that.
Thank you, David. I'm going to ask you the final question and come to you, which is about the impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities in particular, and the extent to which we obviously know there's been a big public health challenge with BAME communities, but economically we perhaps know a little bit less about how those communities are faring through the crisis, although we can imagine that there are greater challenges given precarious work and some of the economic characteristics of that group. I just wondered, what's your view on how the crisis is affecting or will affect BAME communities?
Yeah, I mean, it does look particularly acute for them, partly for exactly the kind of reasons to do with access to physical space I mentioned at the beginning. Like a surprisingly high proportion of BAME people live above the 5th floor. So there's things like just access to space. And there is some evidence that their labour market experience has been rather worse than for other groups. So yeah, that is an issue, and it's why we've got to put renewed effort into being imaginative about working, especially with the kind of employers that they may be working with, to promote educational and training opportunities, mobility in every sense. And this actually links to the previous question. Pre-virus, one of the big problems for young people was they just weren't moving as much as they used to. And we try to understand why their wages are low. Geographical mobility, social mobility go together. Young people were too stuck. It would be terrible if this crisis means they're more stuck. It would be fantastic if BME or other groups, you just get an opportunity to move somewhere different. That is a crucial part of young people moving on. They really do need that opportunity. Set them free, get them moving.
In the interest of time, I am going to close the session there because we've only got 1 minute remaining. But I just want to, in that 1 minute, I just want to say, first and foremost, thank you so much to Laura, David and James for giving up your precious time to be with us today. We launched this series, the Bounce Back Bigger series, because we felt like there needed to be some more debate on some of the big pressing economic issues, especially as the government gets into some of the policy making around the recovery, to ensure that we're surfacing some of the big questions from the public, and we're also using our network to kind of host these types of discussions. We're not able to do them in person anymore. We used to do lots of events, public events in person, but we hope that this digital series allows us to reach even more people and to surface some of these debates in a way that can live on YouTube for many months to come. So thank you for giving up your time and thoughts and having such a kind of brilliant and interesting discussion. I felt like we got into a lot of different issues, and there's certainly lots of fruit for us to take away and kind of munch on as we develop new policy ideas. We have another one of these events tomorrow, which is on debt and recapitalizing businesses. We've got Jason Furman, Obama's former chair of economic advisors, Rupert Harrison, who did the same job for George Osborne, and Peter Oppenheimer from Goldman Sachs tomorrow. So please do tune in to that. You can find details on our website, and we have future events on levelling up and on some of the fiscal challenges. So tax and spend, actually, how do we pay for all this in the coming weeks as well. So a packed series, and thank you very much to everyone who tuned in and engaged with the debate through questions. On that note, I'm going to close. I've taken up 1 minute more of your time than I intended to. So thank you very much, and I'll speak to all of you very soon. Thanks.